James Callum, thank you so much for joining me today. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to have you on.
Thank you, Ro.
Now, let's start with your story of Afghanistan. This podcast is all about stories. How did your Afghanistan story begin?
Well, my professional life has really been in two halves. For the first 30 years of my life, I was a soldier. And in the last 10 years, I have been a humanitarian running the Halo Trust. And I first went to Afghanistan in the immediate aftermath, really, of 9/11. And I remember visiting in the winter of 2001. Um, Kabul at that time felt like a city emerging from a medieval period. The Taliban, in its first version, had fallen, and it was still a pretty bleak place, and made more bleak by the fact it was very, very cold that winter. Um, and I was struck then by just the sheer beauty of the country and the extraordinary talent and the wonderful nature of its people in all their various communities. I then, as so many people in the British Army did, became distracted by Iraq, and I was in Iraq for much of the period 2004, 2007. But I was then made the commander of a brigade, and for those who don't know, it's a force of about 10,000 soldiers, um, and my job was to be the British commander in Helmand province, and I was there in 2009, 2010, and it was the height of the fighting in Helmand, the height of the NATO operation. It had a very formative effect on my life. And I then left the army in 2015, and it's been my great pleasure and honor actually to run the Halo Trust since then. And Afghanistan is really absolutely central to Halo. For those who don't know Halo, it's the world's largest and oldest landmine clearance charity. And it was founded in Afghanistan in 1988 and then expanded into where it is today, 12,000 people in 32 countries. But Afghanistan remains absolutely at the heart of what we do. And I've been coming back to Afghanistan since 2015. And of course, that time frame has a very important event taking place in the middle of it, which is the fall of the Republic and the coming to power for the second time of the Taliban. And so I've seen Afghanistan really in three periods. Immediately after 9/11, the period of NATO, and then now the period of the Taliban.
Your first trip to Afghanistan, I've only landed in Kabul twice, 2018, 2021. It's quite a special, unique experience in itself. But landing in winter in a place where, the Taliban had just fallen, the world had changed, Afghanistan had become such a focus for the Western world. And there was a lot of optimism. Despite the cold, there was a lot of optimism. And many people have spoken about how shocked they were about the state of the city and the people. How would you characterize your experience?
Yeah, I think it was certainly the poorest country I'd been to, and I'd been to many up until that point. Um, I think the primary difference between Kabul in the winter of 2001 and the Kabul of today is it was a medieval city in which poverty ruled. The population was far, far smaller. Now, despite everything, Kabul is a large, um, thriving city in many ways, far larger population, you know, traffic, pedestrians, bustling life going on. And whilst I think many people assume that with the second coming of the Taliban, it's like it was pre 9/11, that's not actually true. The Taliban, whatever one might think about them, cannot change the demographic reality of modern day Afghanistan, notably of Kabul. It is a very, very different place from pre 9/11.
And of course, Britain has had a prior to that, Britain had had a history with Afghanistan, Kabul in particular. Your fellow Scot, Alexander Burns, were there.
Well, it's a bit before my time. Yes. um, yeah, I mean, as we all know, in the 19th century and early 20th century, three Afghan wars, not all of which had gone especially well for the British. And Afghans, proud warriors and fine fighters. So you know what you're doing when it comes to the art of war. But yes, but again, that's very much history. My interest is really in Afghanistan and its future.
Talking to history, one of the things I've really found fascinating, and I've spoken to a lot of British diplomats, soldiers, politicians who've worked in Afghanistan, and it is a sense of history that they often get reminded. I mean, Sir Laura Bristow told me, and Sir Nick Kay as well, said he would often get lectured either in Kandahar or Kabul by senior Pashtun government officials to remind the Brits of their history. And, Karzai in particular apparently was very much into his history. And in Helmand, where you spend, the bulk of your time, was Sir Nick Kay told me this story that we had a gathering of all these village elders and district elders who came here, and we gave them all, our selling points to say we've got all these things for you. We're here to serve you. We're here to protect you, build bridges, roads, hospitals, but we also got guns and money to protect all of that. And all these village elders nodded and said, we really admire that. And it says there was one last you know, elder from a neighboring district who rose up and said, all of these things that you're saying are nonsense. You British are here to avenge the Battle of Maiwand. I mean, did you get reminded ever of that?
um, I mean, Maiwand is a famous event of which Afghans are very proud. No, I love my history. I read a lot of history, but I was in Afghanistan to think about the future,
Hmm.
and I think there's a tendency to believe that the British arrived ignorant of the past. I don't think that's true at all. Actually, I think most of the senior officers or indeed junior soldiers had read a lot about Afghanistan and had gone out of their way to learn about the country, and we absolutely understood our history in that country.
Helmand. Let's talk about Helmand because it's such a starker place to everywhere else, at least to Kabul and other urban areas. But Helmand's entirely different thing.
It's very, very different, largely because it was the beneficiary of the largest US funded civil engineering project anywhere in the world up until the 1960s. The Helmand River Valley Authority, based on the Tennessee River Valley Authority, basically involved the Helmand River, which is fed by meltwater from the Hindu Kush, and damming it, creating a canal and ditch system that would irrigate the valley and turn what was previously a desert into an incredibly fertile area. People tend to think of Afghanistan in terms of incredibly romantic, wild mountains, but the center of Helmand looks like a garden. I mean, it's very, very symmetric. It's laid out in a grid system. It's very flat, very, very green. It can sustain 2 crops a year on that soil, but it's highly artificial and it's entirely dependent upon the Helmand River Valley and its 2 dams at Kajaki and Gereshk.
And Lashkargah, of course, is such a different city from everywhere in Afghanistan because it was built by Americans for the Americans who person there.
Exactly, it's a new town. I mean, it's a grid city, just like any American, city in the Midwest. It's totally different from the rest of Afghanistan.
Now, as a soldier, you commanded British forces at the height of the fighting, 2009, 2010, and that was also the deadliest year for British forces as well. Just talk about that experience.
Um, it was a particularly bloody time. My brigade um, took 64 soldiers killed and many hundreds wounded. But I think it's worth noting the numbers of Afghans who died, which was a lot more. And so the scale of the fighting was very intense, but the purpose was quite different because we had a new commander in the form of General Stanley McChrystal, who'd forged his experience of counterinsurgency in Iraq under General David Petraeus. And he had recommended to President Obama that the same recipe for Iraq, a surge, was attempted in Afghanistan. He didn't get all that he wanted, but he got about half of the surge that he wanted. And so the aim was to, in terms of the doctrine of counterinsurgency, apply more forces to use less force. And in counterinsurgency, the duty is not to kill the enemy, but to protect the people and to surge in a lot more troops to dominate the ground, protect the people, and reduce the level of violence. And so that medicine was applied in the summer of 2009, beginning of 2010, and it actually worked. It's a bit like taking the temperature off a patient. It began quite quickly to reduce the number of casualties. The problem was it's an incredibly expensive thing to do. Those numbers of boots on the ground are very, very hard to afford, both in blood and treasure terms, for a prolonged period of time. And so it was kind of the right thing to do as a means of deheating the insurgency and indeed morally for the people of Helmand. But how it was going to be sustained, that was the real problem.
Talk about your relationship with the local populations. I mean, how was that working and how was it not working, given, for a large part, the Taliban were the people of the area. They were not some sort of alien forces coming and fighting in different parts. What is it the right way of putting it?
I think the politics is more complicated than that. I mean, essentially, Helmand, like so many parts of Afghanistan, is tribal. So you've got to understand the polity in which you're operating, and you've got to understand that tribal polity and work out which tribes are backing whom. And yes, some were certainly supporting the Taliban and the shadow governance of the Taliban, but there was also, other Helmandis and other Afghans who were loyal to the Republic. And there were people in between those two positions. So you had to understand what the polity was, get under the skin of it and work with tribal leaders, work with communities. And the job of the commander, which in normal war is a technocratic one of commanding troops and applying lethal force, in my case, was diplomatic, political. It was about trying to work with the local actors, but also working with the Afghan army and police. And a key part of what General McChrystal wanted to achieve was actually to create direct partnerships between the NATO force and with Afghans, so that we could train them, and then they could begin to take control, and we could begin to take a back seat. Because this, as you pointed out earlier, the Afghans are not particularly fond of foreign interventions, and we knew that, and we wanted as quickly as possible to make this Afghan-owned if we could possibly manage it.
But why was it not succeeding? What was it such a struggle?
Well, it did succeed, because by the summer of 2010 and into 2011, the numbers of casualties began to drop off extremely rapidly. And just as it had done in Iraq under General Petraeus, the insurgency began to lose momentum quite significantly. What went wrong was that in the context of the British, a new government came in replacing the Labour government, the coalition government under David Cameron came under quite a lot of internal pressure to end the campaign, and he took different points of view. I remember the moment.
And you were against that?
I was asked to come down to to Chequers to speak to the first meeting of his National Security Council, and he had literally a sort of sixth form debate in the dining room. I'll never forget it. In one corner were those advising him to sort of leave now, Rory Stewart, and I'm a friend of Rory, like him a lot, but you can disagree with friends. And then in the other corner were those saying, actually, let's not move hastily. Our commitment should be to the Afghan people. We're delivering successfully on the mission. Don't lose the faith. What Cameron actually did was to reject both points of view and to say we will compromise and we will leave in 2014. Now, and this was in the summer of 2010. The Afghans, the old joke, that you may have the clocks, but we have all the time. And now the time was set for 2014. So I think that was a very unwise decision by David Cameron, and frankly, the Obama administration mirrored it at a much larger scale. So the moment that deadline was set, really, destiny moved in only one direction.
And moving fast forward, because I'm really conscious of your time, how were those, the days in August like? By then you'd taken over, leading Halo. How were the August, not as a, as someone responsible for running an organization, but as a soldier? How would you rationalize it for yourself emotionally and personally, but also for the families and the spouses of the soldiers who didn't come home?
Yeah, I mean, I had left the army. You're talking about August 2021, and we faced the sudden arrival of the Taliban in Kabul and the fall of the Republic. And it was obvious just how unprepared the international community was for that. It was obvious to me when they arrived in Lashkar and then they got to Kandahar that it wasn't going to be long before they got to Kabul. I remember very vividly calling a board meeting, and I have some very distinguished foreign policy experts on my board, and unanimously to a man and woman, we decided that we would not join the evacuation. With 2,500 staff, it would have been logistically impossible anyway. We would go to ground, and that our duty is to the people of Afghanistan. They are our beneficiaries, and it doesn't matter who the regime is. We would remain neutral and impartial and go to ground and come out of hibernation. And 2 weeks later, we did just that. We came out of hibernation, went back to work, and have continued since. And I am really proud of the fact that that was the decision we took, because it's very easy to be critical of the Taliban, but most of the measures taken to punish them don't actually harm them at all. The only people they harm are the innocent people of Afghanistan, and in our context, 60 people a month, mostly children, are still being killed and wounded by unexploded ordnance. Who could it possibly help if we stopped working on that clearance?
I mean, so admirably that because of that purpose of that mission, you stayed behind, but a lot of organizations didn't. And there've been a debate about whether, that wholesale evacuation from Afghanistan was the right thing to do. I mean, what do you think?
Well,
Because it depleted the country
yes,
of a lot of talent.
yes, it absolutely
But
did. Now, I'm no apologist for the Taliban. Afghanistan is now the only country in the world that doesn't allow girls to go to secondary school. It's the only Muslim country in the world that doesn't allow women to work. I mean, that is not right. It is deplorable. But it's not a question whether it's right or wrong. It's what you do about it. And my view is that, 30, 40 years ago, you could argue that Saudi Arabia was equally conservative. But by sticking with it, by patient, persistent diplomacy, Saudi Arabia is changing. That's how it's going to be in Afghanistan. And nature abhors a vacuum. And if the West left, others filled that vacuum. Russia, China, other countries that have less regard for human rights. So I don't think we have done any good by walking off the pitch. And I think that Afghanistan needs us. Now, that's not to say our presence should be unconditional. Far from it. I think we should be applying, significant pressure to the Taliban to change their ways. But one also needs to understand what the Taliban is. It's essentially a political coalition, and it combines pretty conservative Kandaharis, mostly of a rural disposition, with a more metropolitan Haqqani network, who have, despite the fact that in many instances they themselves have been quite hardline, a more expansive worldview. And the Taliban has its own right wing in the form of what's called ISKP, the Islamic State in the Khorasan province, and they are very aware of their right flank, so to speak. They have many tens of thousands of young men who have been fighters. They are very conscious of losing those young men to their rights. They have a spiritual leader who's very unworldly, has no political engagement with his own people, let alone people from the West. And so it's not a jihadi international terrorist organization. People often think of the Taliban, or British people do, as if it's Al Qaeda or Islamic State. It's not. It's essentially a very nationalist, Pashtun, internalized movement. It's not interested in exporting jihad, and we should consider it in those terms as a coalition that needs to keep together and has a right flank. And because we don't tend to think of it in those terms, we don't really understand why it takes the positions it does. And if we did understand that better, then we could apply more intelligent levers to changing it.
I think such has been the shock, of the way the Taliban managed to undo a lot of the things that, the 20-year that you and many of your, fellow soldiers went there and dedicated their lives, and many didn't come home. Such has been the shock about how they managed to undo most of those things, that any talk of, reconstructing a positive relationship of any form would mean as an appeasement of a group, or I suppose, giving them further incentives that their hard line, their harsh punishment of particularly women work, and the West are willing and ready to work with them under that condition as well.
Well, I certainly don't think we should be appeasing them, but it's a strange thing that we still have an embassy in Moscow, when there's a war going on in Ukraine, but we don't have an embassy in Kabul. No, I think what we should be doing is, that's the very reason why I think we should be present, is in order to persuade, cajole, and apply pressure to get them to change. If you're not there, you're not going to be heard. So, and I think that's a big mistake. And indeed, what's so interesting at the moment is that this is moving from a counter-terrorism, counterinsurgency narrative to a more traditional geostrategic one, in which the recent clashes with Pakistan see the Taliban behaving not as a kind of insurgent power, but as a mainstream power in which it's having a symmetric military confrontation with Pakistan. So, the Taliban are in power. I think, hopes that they're going to suddenly fall apart I think are not true. And indeed, if they did fall apart, would it actually be in anyone's interests? Because, the truth is, it's actually a pretty stable place at the moment. You can travel around Afghanistan. I went back to Helmand this summer, and I drove from Lashkargah up through Babaji, Chayangir, Gareshk. I stopped in Sangin. I then had lunch in Kajaki. I mean, it's almost surreal to be able to say that. Who could possibly imagine it could be that peaceful? And it is. Now, it is not perfect for all the reasons we've just talked about. It is a very, very, dark and anti-democratic country, but nevertheless, that stability is of value, and the West should try to work with it because the Taliban are, fixing power lines. They've dealt with the poppy crop, not completely, nobody ever would, but to quite a large degree. And it is a country, apart from anything else, never mind the moral reasons for being there, that has large mineral reserves and could be extremely valuable. So, there's quite a lot of speculation at the moment about President Trump looking at Afghanistan through his lens, and talk of reopening Bagram Air Base. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea. But the minerals that lie beneath Afghanistan's mountains, those would be of significant interest to him. So there are new narratives arising all the time as to why you should not ignore Afghanistan.
And Afghanistan's got this thing about it. There's something unique that no other country or not many country are able to attract so much of a keen interest from all sorts of power throughout its history. And now, you've spoken about the situation for women on Afghanistan. One of the things I saw, one of your interviews with the Times newspaper was, you said, which I found it shocking, really, that the Taliban's intelligence agency is the largest employer of women in Afghanistan, despite all the things that they do to women.
Yeah, and the their desire to maintain a network of informants is, in some ways chilling, but that's the truth of it. Um, but I mean, one has to work with that reality, and I think it's just worth mentioning some things that sound kind of countercultural. I mean, we struggled to actually employ women under the Republic. The reason being it was just so unsafe. I mean, after the reduction in the NATO operation in 2014, large parts of the country became so violent that women really feared for their lives. We're actually employing more women now in Halo than we did under the Republic. Um, Not many people realize that's possible, but that's through talking to the Taliban and making things happen. So, I just think those sorts of perspectives are worth keeping in mind. I am no apologist for the Taliban. I keep saying this, but I think we need to have a more nuanced understanding of what's going on in Afghanistan.
One of the key thing about Halo, the reason I value what they do is, I've had an experience in a village where you think you'd be far removed from any sorts of landmines, where it was a daily part of life in has been for millions of people across Afghanistan. But I exactly remember that there was um, a friend of ours from school, and he was a tall boy, and because of the hunger that people faced under the Taliban blockade, people were constantly pushed to the edges of the mountains to get something to eat. And because of young kids being young, and some parents believe that places on the hills and the mountains where there are landmines, there'd be, they would not trigger a landmine to explode. And, there are kids, his name was Hussein, this tall boy, the landmine did trigger and he was killed, and his cousin was severely injured. And a few months later, we had a group of men turn up at our school with, with uh, of course, with replicas of landmines, and this man, the young man, wearing a blue jacket, showing us how to recognize landmines. And he was, so innocent. He was saying, "This is not a landmine. Sorry, this is not a pen. This is a landmine. This will kill you. This is not a butterfly toy. This will kill you." But the point I'm trying to make is your colleagues in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world, they're playing with their lives day in, day out. And it is that we need to appreciate and understand. And they've paid heavy prices for it. And you had your colleagues, 10, 11 of them were killed by ISKP because they were Hazaras, right?
Yeah. Well, it was an appalling event in June of 2021. But your story, I think, is so lovely because you're actually the first person I've ever met in the West who was the beneficiary of a lesson given by Halo about the dangers of landmines to children. And we go in every day into schools. We talk to primary age boys and girls. We go into compounds. We talk to families. We distribute leaflets, um, and we educate people about the dangers that you describe. Because landmines, there's a kind of myth that if you're a child, your body weight is not enough to detonate a landmine. Well, that's not true. And there's a myth that the 40 millimeter NATO cannon round, because it's got a yellow tip, it's made of gold. Clearly not true. And young children are going out into the hills to find these materials because they think there's some value to them, and they're being hurt all the time. And landmine clearance, in the way I'm describing it, which is just risk education, is incredibly inexpensive, and yet it has such value in saving life. I should just add, we're funded by the British government. We get about £2.5 million a year to fund our work, and the cost of housing refugees in hotels runs to about twice that every single day in this country. And so people who say, oh, overseas aid money is too expensive, I would just say for that tiny amount of money, £2.5 million a year, there are about 4 million Afghans who are living in safety on land cleared by Halo. And in other words, as you know, much of Afghanistan is incredibly fertile, but it can't actually produce a crop unless the irrigation system's working. But so many of the canals and ditches had landmines or IEDs in them, and we've been clearing that. For 4 million people are living on land, they don't need to migrate. They're not coming to Britain. They're happy where they are. And there are many millions more who've received risk education lessons. So, I think that's just in its own right, the best possible reason to continue to help Afghanistan.
But what is the current state of Afghanistan in terms of mine clearance, and how much work still is left with? I mean, has there been estimates by
Yes,
you?
there has. Yeah, there's a very, very clear understanding of how much is left to do. But the problem falls in three parts. There's the residual Soviet problem from the 79, 89 decade. That's less and less because we've basically got rid of the problem. We've put the landmines in the history books. The second problem is the Taliban era IEDs, improvised explosive devices, very, very dangerous, very lethal systems, buried to catch NATO soldiers. But long after the NATO soldiers have left, they continue to harm civilians. And then the third problem is NATO munitions, of which there's vast amounts scattered around the country. So those are the three problems. There's a very clear understanding of how much contamination is left, about 1,000 square kilometers. And we know, we can get the last mine out of the ground for good, not just in the sense of forever, but in the sense of creating something good that comes past it in the form of housing, in the form of roads, in the form of schools, in the form of hospitals. We can make Afghanistan into a thriving country. So that's why we do what we do.
And as part of your work, you must, of course, work with Taliban officials on the ground to make sure that your staff are safe, that the environment in which they're working are protected, and you make trips to the country. And tell me about gifting a, I don't know, melted Ferrero Rocher to a senior Taliban official.
Um, well, I'm ashamed to admit that this particular minister presented me with a very smart ceremonial robe, and I was, very honoured to receive it. And I asked my team if we had a gift, and they looked rather shamefaced. And all they could find in their rather scruffy bag was a box of melted Ferrero Rocher chocolates. But through the interpreter, he had the good grace to say, "It's the thought that counts." So anyway, that was nice of him. But yeah, I go back and I try to do better with my gifts. So last year, year before last, I gave a silver presentation landmine, which we have as gifts. But I hadn't checked with this particular minister, but he'd lost an eye and a leg to a landmine in the 1980s. So he looked a bit nervous about my gift, but I was able to assure him that it was entirely inert and was just a nice silver gift for him.
How is that, how do the encounters work? I'm really fascinated that you commanded British forces and you're pointing guns at each other at some point very violently, and now you go there. I am, that general who killed a lot of your men, and you killed my men. It tells you something about the psychology of Afghanistan, of course, but how does it work out for you?
Well, I did wonder that myself, of course. The first time I went, it was a bit of a leap into the unknown. But actually, a few things I would say is that, wars end in negotiation. Um, I had an uncle who was killed. He was a young man. He was killed in Cyprus in the Cypriot insurgency of the late 1950s. But 2 years after his death, Cyprus emerged as a democracy, and the leader of the then insurgency became a respectable politician. My I served in Northern Ireland. My father served in Northern Ireland. My father was actually hit by an IRA sniper. Fortunately, he survived. But the IRA came in from the cold and joined in the democratic political process. That's how Northern Ireland is. That's how I see it. I have no problem doing that. I was recently in Syria, and the new Syrian government, its leader is Al Sharar, is an ex-member of Al Qaeda. He's changed, and I find that ability to put war behind us as redemptive. There has to be hope, and I'm lucky. I'm one of the few British soldiers to have gone back to Helmand and to Iraq, and to see that a different future is possible. I think for many soldiers, they must wonder what on earth that whole war was for. Why did they go to Helmand? Why did they lose their mates there? Perhaps why were they wounded? And they may have a sense of futility, but I think I can tell them that actually there can be a better future and peace can come. And I find that incredibly uplifting.
But given the costs for that 20 years, and a lot have been said about, a lot has been said about how much was achieved in the country, but the costs were enormous. I mean, do you think costs, benefits, did they ever match? I mean, were they worth it?
Well, what you're really asking is, was that over the course of that 20-year period, could knowing what we know now, could you have done things differently? Yes, yes, and yes. There were very significant moments when the Taliban could have been brought in from the cold, notably in the sort of Bond period in 2004, a bit earlier maybe. And I believe firmly that there should have been a far more political line of operation to try and end it through talking rather than fighting. Yes, absolutely. The vast amounts of money that was spent ultimately could have been done differently. However, Afghanistan is not where it was in 2001. The Taliban may have, to use their word, had all the time, but none of the clocks. Actually, they can't wind back time. And Kabul, Afghan society is totally different from what it was under the first version of the Taliban. And they're not even trying to change it. You can drive around Kabul today. You see women on the street going about their business. You see marriage halls. You see people going to restaurants. It's simply not true to say that Afghanistan today is living in the same version of Afghanistan before 9/11. So a lot was achieved. And I walked around Lashkar. I went into a park in June, and there were me and two other British people, and we were surrounded by, I suppose, a crowd of about 100 odd Afghans. They were all happy and smiling and shaking hands. that is the legacy. It's a more peaceful society today, and people can draw comfort from that fact.
Yeah. And now I always tend to, end our conversations because this podcast is all about telling Afghanistan stories. Um, when you have your moments of delight, shall we say, with your favorite beverage, what are the stories that comes to your mind when you share that for the laugh out loud moments? There have been plenty of grief, but what are the stories that you share with your friends over a pint or over a glass of red wine or whiskey?
Yeah.
You're a Scot, so you probably is a whiskey.
But I the thing that makes soldiering bearable really is the humor, and for me there is just soldiers have this incredible sense of humor. They enjoy the ridiculous aspects of soldiering, the discomfort. But what I really like about Afghans is that the Afghans have this incredible sense of humor, and even the Taliban. I was sitting in the outer office of the governor of Ghazni last summer, and I was with a. I won't say his name to forget if spare his blushes, but he was a slightly older man, and one of the Taliban said, you're looking your age because Afghans can be very blunt,
Mm.
and he looked a bit shocked by this, and he said, "Are you married?" And he said, "Yes, he was." And he said, "Well, you should be taking a second wife. I could fix you up with one this afternoon if you like." And they all fell about laughing, and because they knew that it was just fun to embarrass a Westerner. But and then you realize you're not talking to just a man with a gun, an AK-47 and a big turban and a beard. You're talking to a real human being, and I think that's what um, motivates me.
And of course, as you said, the world opened itself, especially the West opened itself to, hundreds of thousands of Afghans throughout those 20 years and following the fall. And you've got thriving communities of Afghans all over Europe, of America, Australia. So you've got a massive diaspora. And what would be, I suppose, your message to the diaspora, the responsibilities that they'll be carrying, but of course, you call to action for, any political British, the Western governments now that they have
Yeah.
to maybe there's a time for a bit of mea culpa or not.
Well, let me start with the Western governments. My message to them is don't forget about Afghanistan. You ignore Afghanistan at your peril. That's the first thing. But for the Afghan diaspora, you are a country of extraordinary talent and diversity. You have people from all sorts of different parts of the Afghan community, such as yourself, Hazaras or Pashtuns or whoever. You have a huge range of talent, and you've come out of Afghanistan. You're building lives, you're building businesses. People are thriving, but you don't want to forget the country of your birth because people there need you, and organizations like Halo are suffering from the reductions in government funding, born of new crises in the world, in Ukraine, in Sudan, and Gaza, and that's all understandable. But since those Western countries will turn to those new problems, we need the Afghan diaspora to help us. And if there are Afghans out there who want to fund our work, please do get in touch.
That's great. And on that note, thank you so much. It's really been a privilege talking to you.
Ro, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you as well. Thank you so much.